Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to another Sports Community live stream. I'm Steve Pallas, and joining me again for another Tuesday to look at complaints and those sorts of related issues. I'm joined with Mike Ronchi. Mike, welcome to the Sports Community live stream.
G'day, Steve. How's your week been?
Well, as long as Richmond and Melbourne Storm by and large keep winning, that's kind of what drives us through this lockdown period in Melbourne, what's happening in our sporting teams and to a degree how homeschooling's going. But yeah, all good, mate, all good.
Excellent.
We've talked over a number of weeks about the different complaints that come through from sports clubs to peak bodies, and in your role as the Member Protection Information Officer for Cricket Victoria over a very long period of time, you experienced a lot, and you've been great in taking us through issues and complaints relating to AGMs, selection. What else am I missing? There's 3 or 4 different topics.
Tribunals, etc.
Tribunals, yeah, absolutely. And the one that we'd left to last, which really sadly becomes really timely, is the concept of, I guess, personal interaction issues and racial discrimination, bullying, harassment, in that box. And I guess we're having today's discussion on the back of a story written in the ABC and released by the ABC, telling the story of Robbie Muir, an AFL Aboriginal footballer. And the story really, while the heading says the prosecution of Robbie Muir is the story football doesn't want to hear, I think that heading needs to be the persecution of Robbie Muir is the story that we all must hear. And I think it takes through the tremendous impact that vilification or discrimination or bullying has on an individual, and it's such a powerful story. But if we step outside the Robbie Muir discussion, Ronks, and just look at vilification, harassment, discrimination more generally, what were the sort of scenarios that were coming through to Cricket Victoria over the journey?
Yeah, okay. They're quite common and quite varied. Although when I say quite common, I don't mean they were happening all the time. Most sports now, or every sport now, has a member protection policy in which most of these, the vilification, bullying, intimidation, harassment, whether that's just by, purely harassing people, it doesn't have to be sexual harassment. It can be just however a person feels aggrieved about a situation can make a complaint. And that's where the Member Protection Information Officer's role becomes important, as to how to advise complainants of how to handle those issues and where to go. Look, racial vilification and racial slur and racism, unfortunately, is still part of our sporting landscape. And if you read the Robbie Muir article, which I'd encourage everyone to do, it's an incredible story. It just goes
put
to
the
show
link in the notes for this session.
Yeah, goes to show you how bad it was and where we've come from now. I think we're heading into a really good space now that we're aware of all this. And that's a Member Protection Information Policy's role, and so is the officer. So you may have a racial vilification incident during a match, a game of any sport. Most associations now and sporting codes rules are fairly clear on that subject, and it's usually a mandatory report if you get found that you've been doing it on the field. Again,
where do those reports normally come from? Would they come from the person who received the experience, or would it be the umpires? Who was making those reports?
Yeah, good question. Usually it's an umpire who may have heard something or overheard something. It can be where a player can approach a referee or an umpire or official and say, hey, I've just been racially abused. and the umpire can take action there where they might just take note of that, follow up after the game, and if deemed that there is a case to answer, can refer. You can't, look, I wouldn't expect an umpire to report anyone if they actually didn't hear what was said. So there's several ways where it can eventually become to the official's notice, whether it's via the umpire, players, supporters. The club might write a formal letter of complaint to the association body, and it goes from there.
It's a really interesting period for sport because it's almost a transition period, because what was deemed acceptable previously in this space, and I guess that's what Robbie Muir's experience showed us, what was deemed acceptable by players and clubs and leagues. I mean, the story is horrendous, but it was deemed to be acceptable, and now it's absolutely completely unacceptable. But we've got a transition period where people from one era are still participating, so that's that transition sort of side, and getting to understand what, I think that's where we have a lot of challenge in understanding what was once acceptable is now not acceptable, and it applies to things that are not we're talking here child safety, same sort of concept. What was once acceptable, i.e. coaches waiting, but with kids in the car park waiting for the parents to come by themselves, is now no longer acceptable. So I think that's also a real challenge that clubs need to deal with right now.
Yeah, correct. And it's a lot broader too with the diversity now. It's not just racial vilification, it's sexual discrimination. It's all about diversity. It's a lot broader now. It's religion comes into it, creed, gender, the whole lot now, which is great. We've got to be careful both as participants, spectators, supporters, and officials. It's you've got to navigate your way fairly formally and stringently. There are, in a lot of the member protection policies, there's ways to deal with it all. It's all spelled out. There's procedures and processes that should be followed accordingly. And you raise a good point in that it's not acceptable anymore. I remember a case a couple of years ago where I was sitting in a cricket tribunal, and there was a little bit of argy-bargy out on the field, just some verbal banter, and the outgoing batsman, who happened to be Sri Lankan, turned around and used the term white blokes. He said, "What are you white blokes looking at or complaining about?" And the umpire reported him for bringing colour into the issue, and he was suspended for 1 week. So that's how far we've come in that, one rule doesn't apply to just one. It goes across the whole board now. It's very diverse.
It was interesting because my eldest daughter went and worked with Netball Victoria for many years and in the inclusion space. And I guess it was her that introduced me to the term unconscious bias. So, I really didn't understand what unconscious bias was, or unconscious discrimination. And she took me through a whole range of different examples that relate to gender, just racial, as all the different groups of people can be affected. And I guess that's why, if we look at something completely outside sport, one of the biggest rock bands in the world, particularly if you are a country music lover like myself, the Dixie Chicks just completely changed, or not completely changed their name, have been around for 2 decades, hit after hit after hit, actually dropped the word Dixie over the last couple of months to be just the Chicks, because of the racial undertones and the historical significance of that word, the Dixie, in the Chicks. So that's an unconscious. They never meant at any stage to be racially impacting anybody, and that was never their intention. But it was an unconscious bias.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we all come with unconscious bias. It's the way you've been brought up and conditioned to the way your lifestyle is lived. And yeah, that's where we've just got to step back and I guess take an approach where you need to really think things through before you brand something or you say something or call something, whatever. I mean, there's a lot of sporting clubs that are called the such and such blacks.
Yes.
All of a sudden, eyes were raised when we were going through all the Black Lives Matters movement and still going through it. It's now becoming, rather than a subconscious thing, it's everyone's consciously aware of it now and treading around carefully on it.
Yeah, and yes, exactly. And I think one of the wonderful things about what the introduction of member protection has done is that it's one thing to see a scenario, but a lot of volunteers are not sure how to deal with that scenario. You know, if you're the club president that someone comes to and says, "Hey, this has happened to me," potentially that's almost the most horrendous position for a club president, because they're as far out of their depth as they can be. For some people, those personal interaction issues, and particularly vilification, harassment, etc. But what the member protection policy does is then give a step-by-step process and complaints, a step-by-step process that really gives the confidence and support to the volunteers in the club that need to and must deal with the issue that's arisen. And it also then gives a framework for ensuring that, I mean, the key is to ensure they don't arise and creating that environment where people understand what's now acceptable.
Yeah, look, volunteers that find themselves in that situation, I can't encourage them enough to go to a member protection information officer, which they may have appointed it formally at their club. If not, the association will, and if not, the state body will, and they are all very helpful in any situation. They can give you the guidance and talk you through and show you through each sport's processes and procedures to handle any complaints of any type. There's a formal process, and then there's a more casual process where it just leads to mediation, and you try and deal with it between the aggrieved person there. And if that doesn't come to fruition, well, then you can take a formal process. But all of the policies spell out exactly step by step and the process and procedures to follow.
Yeah, and so that's really important. The other area, just on touching, I see regularly as the risk is, and I go back to that point about what was once normal, acceptable, common practice, we'll go with, is now completely unacceptable. And it's really driven by people our age, Ronks, the 50-plus-year-olds that are still active in our sporting clubs in one way or another, and they're still behaving in a way that they would have done effectively a generation ago. Yeah. And so the risk is that the next generation are being influenced by those role models in the club. So it's really important we call out that behaviour. And it's really important we empower the younger generation to call out that behaviour that potentially is going to be coming from an older generation to which they might be iconic or really respect in the club.
Yeah, look, I think what I said before, I think we're heading into a good space now. The education, the respect and the of the history. I mean, you've only got to look at I guess how the AFL approach the Indigenous round now. It's fantastic. Like, it's just brilliant. And you can see how grateful and enthusiastic the Indigenous players are of it. It's amazing. And there are events now that attract 80,000 people at the MCG, all branded around the Indigenous game. So yeah, look, it's great. We're moving into a generation that I think will do much better than the previous generation, who have done better than the previous generation before as well. It's just human society.
That's right. And that's why, if I just bring this, add to the screen. That's why I think the heading shouldn't be the persecution of Robbie Muir is the story football doesn't want to hear. I think it's the story that we all must hear. And it's and again, in closing, from my perspective, Ronks, it's not just limited to discrimination of Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders or nationality. It's all groups of people. If there's any sort of discrimination, vilification, harassment, it has a negative effect on any individual. And what this story does is articulate, with the benefit of hindsight and decades of hindsight, what that impact on that on Robbie's life is. And it's one that we all need to kind of recognize and adjust accordingly. So mate, I thank you very much for joining me again on the complaints discussion that we have every week or so. I think it's a really important area to look at, not less about how we deal with the complaints, but more about what's causing them and how do we stop them, and create just a great experience for everybody in the club. So as normal, mate, thank you very much for joining us on the Sports Community live stream.
My pleasure, mate. Have a good day.
All right. And to everybody else, thank you very much for joining us on the live stream, and look forward to joining you tomorrow for another episode of Doing Sport Differently. I'm Steve Pallas. He's Mike Ronchi. And thank you for being part of our sports community.